Hey guys, and welcome to another video review from BXB. This time I'm going to be covering the game developed by 11-bit studios, This War of Mine, The Little Ones, which has recently come to consoles after spending quite a lot of time on PC and being a critical darling for much of 2014 and 2015. This game has won many awards across the board and often highly lauded in the sort of better press sort of sides of things, not just the enthusiastic press, but for example it was Time's Game of the Year in 2014. So just from that you know this is a serious experience. So without further ado, let's get into the bit where I talk over the video footage and discuss the finer points of This War of Mine, The Little Ones. The first thing I want to say about This War of Mine is that I had already played it on PC, and I think what that does is it gives me a bit of an understanding of the game that perhaps you wouldn't if you were coming to this purely as a console experience. To me, there's two types of games. There's the sit back games and there's the sit forward games. And This War of Mine, just by its nature, is a sit forward game. It's the kind of game that expects and demands your attention, demands that you focus on it and you care about your decisions. That's the kind of game which you would play on PC, like an RTS or a MOBA, or even an MMO. Games that require you to focus at all times and, really think about the decisions you're making. This War of Mine is all about important decisions. Basically, it's a take on a sort of urban conflict from the civilian's point of view. So, while you're stranded in this desolate city, there's a war going on around you, but you're not a hero, you're not a soldier, you're a civilian, and you're trapped and you have to survive for as long as possible. It's a dire situation, and for more often than not, when I played these games, my playthroughs ended in my demise. And with This War of Mine, The Little Ones, on the console version specifically, the introduction of children makes this task even more difficult, because children, as we know, are almost purely dependent on adults, and they don't bring much to a survival situation such as the ones you find in This War of Mine. Basically, you have to keep them psychologically happy at all times. You have to keep them fed and watered like your other survivors, and yet they don't really bring anything to the survival sort of side of things. So they become this drain on resources, which is a pretty cold and yet realistic way of looking at children in this situation. The game itself is an experience that you play from this side-on 2D perspective. It's wonderfully stylized with this beautiful sort of scratchy black and white art style, washed out palette. It's a wonderfully stark and austere style that's very emotive and draws you in to this world that's full of depression and struggle. And you do struggle. You struggle to find food. You struggle to survive. You struggle to find components to craft things to help you survive. It's a nightly task. During the day, you sort of take care of your base camp, your sort of house of disrepute, while you desperately in the night time try and find the resources that you will need to survive another day. And it's a continuous struggle. And as I mentioned earlier, with the children involved, it only becomes more difficult. It is, however, a wonderfully realised experience. It makes you think about conflict in a different way, and that's kind of what This War of Mine is all about. It's about thinking about this situation from a different point of view, because if I'm honest, I don't think the game is fun. This isn't a game that is meant to be fun. It's sort of a game about conveying the message of the struggles of war, the terror, the hopelessness, the depression, and the inevitable death that occurs within war. Because you will die. Like I said, your characters, more often than not, won't survive to the end of the war, to when the ceasefire is declared. And when you get to winter and things really start to become horrible and difficult, it's a bleak, harsh experience. But it's a rewarding one, because it gives you that different point of view into the worlds that people have to experience within these conflicts. What 11-bit studios have done with This War of Mine is a tough experience to categorize. It's not really a game in the traditional sense, because it's not designed for fun, which is an odd thing if you consider it. But it also indicates to me why this sort of form of almost edutainment, which is a dirty word in some circles, was so popular upon its release in 2014 and gained the massive amounts of praise that it deserved from such publications as I mentioned at the start as Time. The problem for me, however, is that the game isn't a fun experience. It's a drudge. It's difficult, it's punishing, as the experience would be, which makes it very hard to score from a critical perspective. You could say it's a 10 out of 10 for what it's trying to tell you, or you could say it's a 5 out of 10 because what you're doing isn't inherently fun. The way the characters move around and are controlled is somewhat clunky and imprecise. The base building mechanic isn't as thought out as you would hope it would be, and the scavenging at night can be unfairly harsh and punishing even if you have prepared to your fullest. Sometimes the roll of the dice in a game such as this, a roguelike experience, can be incredibly unfair, and you just won't find what you need to continue. Other times you get a lot more than you need and you find that it's a breeze, so the balancing can also be a problem. It's definitely an experience I recommend trying. It's a little bit hefty, I think, though, the console version, sadly, in price. It would have been better to be a little bit cheaper and therefore a bit more sort of approachable for a wider audience. But I think if you are looking for a palate cleanser and something different to experience between your big AAA and conventional sort of video games, it's worth giving a go if you have the time to put into it. So I think on balance I scored this war of mine, The Little Ones, 7 out of 10.